Hello, my name is Natalie Diano. I will be your professor for this class. Um, and what better place to start this class than at the literal very beginning? I'm going to use our first lecture to talk about the bare bones basic structure of making a composition and a design. And once we have that done really well and we understand these terms and we can practice those, then it will be even easier to start making our images this semester. So we're going to review some terms that review the elements and principles of design. Design is essentially the act of organizing visual elements to put them for a specific purpose. It's something that is finished, and the final piece is meant for something, whether it's an advertisement or some other kind of content, art. There is a reason why that composition exists. So we're going to review what those basic elements are, and those are called the elements of design. And those are known as color, space, line, form, texture, and shape. And these are elementary units to make a composition. To start with line, and then building off of that, line is an element of design defined by a point moving in space. So from here to here, from A to B. A line may be descriptive or literal. It can be implied. Think a sequence of stones on a ground that you can connect in your mind's eye visually, or abstract, which can be something as simple as somebody pointing off frame. All lines have a direction. Horizontal is, of course, from right to left. Horizontal usually gives us a feeling of tranquility. Think, the horizon, the ground is beneath us. Vertical lines are straight up and down. Generally speaking, when we think of when a vertical line is splitting an image, we think about balance, one side versus the other side. And oblique lines are essentially anything in between, anything diagonal. And those are usually very dynamic and are implying some kind of movement. Here on the left, the first image here, is a great example of an oblique line. It's a pretty dynamic image, considering it's just this cathedral. But since it's angled, it almost as if the photographer was walking or in motion when they were taking this picture. Whereas the one on the right here with these trees, the image is split up vertically many ways, and it has this, even down the center with the path a little bit. And we have this really nice balance there. This left image here, we see many, many horizontal lines across this whole picture. And that's, it has this very heavy feeling to it. And this is a great example of an implied line. While there is a line here in the foreground that you can see, as it moves farther back, that becomes lost. It's a very busy image, but we can still visually or subconsciously connect these lines or these dots into a line. Shape is essentially a closed line. It is self-contained, that is usually defined by an outline of contrast in some capacity. It's somehow different than that which is around. Shape is limited to 2 dimensions, so height and width. And there are generally 2 ways you can discuss shapes, geometric and organic. Geometric shapes can also be called inorganic shapes, and those are generally man-made, whereas organic shapes or natural shapes are natural, right? So think, bodies, tree, right? So here's a really easy comparison of these 2 types of shapes. And this is a really nice, these 2 photographs to compare. This is very rigid and structured. We can see essentially everything here is man-made, for fitting the front here. But we got this, the squares, the bricks, the whole building itself. It's very straight. Whereas not only is this a long exposure, which is really making it even more fluid, The shape is of hands, and it's very natural and organic. Form is very similar to shape. It is also a self-contained area, but this is three-dimensional, so it's height, width, and depth. It can be described in the same way as geometric or organic. Since we're working with photographs in this class, shape and form can be a little bit easier interchanged because we are using three-dimensional objects to make two-dimensional objects, right? We're taking pictures of the real world and making it onto a two-dimensional plane, a picture. So we can kind of talk about both of them the same way here. The next term is space, and this is something we are going to discuss many times in this class throughout the semester. It's a very important aspect of all design, and it's sometimes easily overlooked. And we'll be talking specifically about positive and negative space. Positive space being that which appears visually full. Usually that will contain the subject. And negative space is usually that which appears empty, or the area around your subject. Illusionary space has to do with creating an illusion of space on a two-dimensional plane, which is what we are doing here. That can also, of course, be done with drawing and things. And the way that we are going to work with that, the terminology is figure ground. And essentially, figure ground is just the relationship of the figure or the subject to the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. So here we can easily see positive and negative space. The positive space is, filled up by the building, and the negative space is obviously the sky. There isn't even a cloud to add anything else. It's almost as if it's just blue paper back there, right? It's very empty. This too, we have a very clear empty sky, and then we have this bonsai and this other tree back here, obviously full. It has texture, it has detail. We can easily understand that as positive space. This image here on the left, which we've seen before, is almost all positive space, right? Like I said before, it's extremely active. There really isn't anywhere much for the eye to rest, maybe just like up here, and that is where that negative space is. And then this image here on the right is one of the reasons why this is such an important conversation, because I bet that half of you would probably think the positive space is the ground. That's what we would normally expect the positive space to be, the filled area. But in this case, the ground is a silhouette. It's dark. There is no real information. All of the information is in the sky. We have the clouds, we have the texture, we have the color. And so positive and negative space here is a little bit blurred. And it can be kind of arbitrary, which is a good thing. This is one of the reasons why we all see things differently. Some of you may be familiar with the terminology of Gestalt theory, and this is a really great version of an image to talk about that, which is how some of us see positive and negative space a little differently depending on where things are connecting for us visually. Some of us here might see the negative space as the black and the positive space as the white, which kind of has a vase appearance. And some of us may see the white as negative space and see the black as the filled space, and in that case, we would be seeing two portraits. Next is texture, which has to do with the tactility, the visual appearance of something, of a subject or a surface. The surface quality, how you would expect it to feel. Often texture and pattern are intertwined. Here we have this very specific texture with this broken material. And then the other texture is really nicely blurred out. Really nice figure ground example. And then this image here on the right, here we have another nice implied line, although it is kind of connected with that crack. But very highly textured close-up of this tree bark. Of course, we have this texture here of clothing. And this image here on the right is showing us multiple textures. We have this really nice crispy texture of the leaves on top. But this is a long exposure, so the water has this like very dreamy, soft quality to it. Next is color. Scientifically, it is light reflected off objects. And it is characterized by three qualities, which is hue, value, and intensity. Hue is essentially the color's name, right? Green, red, whatever. Value has to do with how light or dark that color is. Um, so pink or burgundy, right, being a value tone of red. If this was a painting class, this would be even easier to show you, but essentially a tint is when you add white to a hue. With my example now, we'll use red as our hue. So adding white to red will make it pink, a lighter shade of red. Shade would be adding black to a hue. So if we were adding black to red, that would become kind of a dark wine color, burgundy. And then a tone is when you add gray. And when you start adding gray, that starts taking out the saturation of that hue, and starts neutralizing it. And that also has to deal with its intensity. Intensity is the correct term for talking about the saturation of a hue, how intense it is. So here in this image on the left, we have this first image here. If you just look at this on this next side, the second image here is simply more saturated in the color red. None of the other colors are affected here, but simply by saturating these red colors more, even the green is starting to pop out, and we have a very clear some focal point. And then this image is simply changing the hue from red to yellow, which makes this an entirely different image. As opposed to this one. Not bad, but definitely a different read. This graphic here on the right is just to give you a visualization of color contrast. You know, when there's like on like, such as this yellow with this darker yellow hue, the contrast is much lower. Even with this one, they're both so bright, it's very hard to see them. Whereas with these other colors, such as this one or this one, there's very high contrast. It's easy to see. This one can be more missed. This is the same image, color corrected two different ways. Just this photograph of this car for the dealership. I like this one. I think that that's what the sky looks like. That's what the ground looks like to me. But they really preferred this, the highly saturated cyan and the ground being a little redder, a little Mars-like. But if you look at the difference between this one and this one, the color contrast is so much greater. It's more saturated a little bit, that we can see the highlights and the shadows even better than in this image here. So the car it's really dynamic in this picture because of that color contrast. This image here, we're essentially just giving this little tubby fat alien boy a more of a saturation of red. And as we are saturating more and more, he gets rounder looking. He has more of a, his tubbiness is warmer and it has more of a shape to it. Simply by, now you can actually see his little funny eyeball, whereas with this one, it's almost gone. And this is a really nice contrast to it. So even the little green ball in front of him is sticking out even more. And as we discuss tints, shades, and tones, we have this really nice image here, which would show us how red can be affected by mixing it with white, gray, or black. And a really nice example of all of the colors going through that kind of a process. So those are the elements of design. And the principles of design is essentially creating unity by using those elements. So the elements of design, this is really important to remember. The elements of design is what is organized, and the principles is how you organize, how you do it. So this is controlling the flow and the structure of your composition, how you organize the elements of design. These terms have to do with unity, balance, variety, movement, contrast, focal point, and so on. We'll start with unity because this is definitely the main goal of using all of these elements in principle of design. And that is the sense of completeness. This is finished. This is done. There is a harmony between all of the parts of the composition, and this is done. The main way that we can understand unity in a composition is balance. And balance is essentially the visual weight of equilibrium within a composition. If you think about your design as a balanced scale, where it can be kind of right heavy or left heavy, depending on how the spread of your elements are. that can make the design seem unbalanced. This can be controlled by the placement and qualities of your elements that you have. This can be color, texture, how large they are, how close they are. So we're working here as if we are using a scale and we're trying to stabilize that scale. Of course, I'm not implying that everything has to be symmetrical. There is, of course, asymmetrical balance as well. These two images here are pretty close to as symmetrical in the real world as you can get, where it's almost as if you flip them together, they would they practically mirror each other. This one's almost symmetrical both sides, through the middle vertically and horizontally. Not quite as symmetrical as this one, but still pretty symmetrical for what we find in the real world. This would be a really nice example of an asymmetrical but balanced image. Excuse me. Mostly just because we have this guy down here, which is disrupting that full sense of symmetry. But it's still a very beautiful, balanced image, and we're going to discuss more why that is so. This one also is kind of really nicely balanced, almost like a yin yang, right, where it's kind of curling into itself. Next is movement. And while some of us may think of movement as like going from one place to another, movement is technically the term for the path that your eye takes while you're looking at a design. And usually that is controlled by focal areas and contrast. Lines and shapes and colors can influence eye motion across a composition. That is also known as visual circulation. So here I have some literal versions of motion. This is light painting, so you can literally see movement from one spot to another, as well as this long exposure that you've seen earlier. You're going to notice that a lot of these images in this presentation are repeated, and that is because you can essentially discuss all of these terms with every image that pretty much exists. So if you were to write these down and you're looking at a classmate's work to critique later, and you don't really know where to begin, you could close your eyes and put your finger on your notebook and make a comment about shape or space or balance or anything like that. So these are really important, and that's why I'm showing you, again, essentially all the same pictures to show you how they can apply. Here we have a really nice version of visual circulation and eye movement, where no matter really where you enter this image, you are being drawn to this center here. And then here we have this movement again. It's kind of, we have this sense of dropping, right? We have the waterfall that is dropping, as well as this heavy looking tree branch. Variety and repetition are the next terms, and they're very similar. Variety has to do with elements that are similar, but they have a diversity between them. This is, such as a variety of color here, variety of texture. This is, the same color, but different lines, size. Repetition is also a really great use of not only strengthening a design. Variety and repetition are really great for strengthening a whole series together, because you are repeating individual elements, right? For example, we can always tell what a Coke commercial is because it's always going to use that red color. And we'll repeat that use no matter what, whether it's Taylor Swift in the commercial or it's just like some little boy having his first sip. I don't know. So because we have that repetition of that color, we're able to make a recognizable and identifiable unit, in this case with the brand. So this can be in shape or color. Perhaps you, have apples in all of your stuff. I don't know. But something that we can see that is repeating itself. And that can also, of course, create a pattern, which is, of course, the repetition of an object or a shape all over a design. So here we have variety and repetition. We have a repetition of rectangular shapes, right? Everywhere, essentially. Some of them longer than others. But then we even have rectangular shapes going vertically. So here we have a repetition of squares, or excuse me, rectangles in a variety of orientations. We have horizontal and vertical rectangles. This is obviously, these infinity rooms are all about repetition, which just creates a pattern. Repetition and variety. This is a really simple way to bring emphasis to a point. It's using the same element, repeating it over and over again, but varying it in one spot to bring your eye to that place. This is, again, the same technique, very easily creating a focal point. Contrast is the juxtaposition of elements in your design, and this is really how you bring emphasis to the places where you want that. Contrast can be through opposite colors in the color wheel, which we saw earlier. It can be contrast of light versus dark, small versus large, horizontal versus vertical, right? If you have a picture of a golf course, but there's only one tree sticking out of it, it's going to have a very large amount of contrast through it. So here we have black and white contrast, where it's, very white or light in the foreground and very dark in the background. And we have this really nice contrast here, not only in having a variety of value, or light and darks, but also a variety of texture, and a contrast of texture, I should say, excuse me, because the texture is blurred out in the rest of this. This image is clearly contrast. Purple and green are opposite colors in the color wheel, and of course black and white. Can't get more contrasty than that. So that's why it kind of has that psychedelic, very moving property to it. Here, if you recognize this picture, we have, again, contrast of whether it's texture and color, value, right? It's very dark down here and very light up there. This is a really nice contrast of, we can talk about the geometric shape of the shipping container versus the natural shape of this mountainside. We could talk about the contrast, right? So this is square, this is natural, very organic. We have the contrast of the size, right? This is very small seeming as opposed to its environment. Here's another, that contrast, color contrast again, where you can really easily see where, this is color contrast here, and then this is very similar, very light contrast. I don't want to imply that contrast is a needed or necessary thing. It's absolutely not. Low contrast can be just as beautiful and successful. This is also really the case with all of these terms here. This is not a set of laws for you to have to follow. These are just guidelines and suggestions so you know what to do. None of these things have to be followed. A lot of them honestly can be broken as long as you can tell me why you did it. For example, you don't have to have a balanced piece if you are, maybe making a poster for a horror movie. Maybe you want something to be kind of unbalanced and unsettling in that image. Or maybe you want something really light and pastel-y and, low saturation because you're going for a particular dream state vibe. All right, next is scale and proportion. They're very similar, so I usually just kind of lump these together. And scale is essentially the relationship of one thing in size compared to that of another. It's a comparison, and proportion has to do with that relationship in the size. This is a really easy example of seeing that, right? We understand here the play in scale because we know proportionally that humans are not smaller than tangerines, right? This image here, it's really a lovely image. We have a clear example of proportion and scale. The proportion of this shipping container to the mountain makes the mountain, seem larger. And I know one of the things that we can always consider when we're talking about scale is what I would say is the most universal form of measurement, which is our bodies. We know generally what eye level is. We know what the average human height is. So we can easily understand that we are bigger than tangerines and we're smaller than a skyscraper, right? So if you think about that while looking at this image here, now we understand we're smaller than the shipping container by a lot. And so we can really understand the mammoth size of the mountain in comparison because we understand that scale. And then the proportion of that just shows how much space is being covered here. This is another really great example of using scale to understand space and figure ground. In this case here, we can understand, we know that human hands are not two different sizes. So even though there was absolutely no information in the background or even really a body to understand, we can understand the general body position and posing, the gesture here, that we have the right hand going away from us, and we have the left hand coming right at us. So here we are able to use proportion to understand, because we know what the scale of a hand is. We're able to use proportion to understand depth when we literally have no other ways to understand depth, no other keys here. And pretty sure this is the last slide, which is emphasis and focal point, or the last term, I should say. Often, focal areas provide a visual entryway into a design. It's something that will attract the eye. It can also often be the last place that your eye rests on, which is known as the visual climax, the place that you want it to rest. Points of emphasis are usually to stress key points in your composition. You want to make something stand out, often by contrast, which can be in so many ways, right? Isolation and placement, color and texture, shape. So the main things to remember about focal points is that there is only one. You have one focal point in an image. Accents are any of those secondary points of emphasis that you might have in your design. So here we have a clear focal point, and we've reviewed so many ways why it is. So this is a really great way to wrap this up. Here, we have the focal point very clearly. It's orange. It's so easy to move right there. The focal point in this image is obviously our shipping container, maybe even the stripe. The stripe is essentially the brightest part of this picture, and it's contrasting heavily to the very intense hue of blue, cyan. And of course, as we discussed earlier, there's a contrast here of this very inorganic shape of the shipping container to its surrounding, which is very natural and organically shaped. The shipping container is super saturated compared to the more muted colors of the background. But that being said, it's not the only place where there is blue, which is why the image is so beautifully balanced. We can find plenty of a tint of blue in the sky, this lighter value of blue up here. It's also less saturated, right? It's not as intense. And there's even some blue here in these grayish areas of this hilly spot. It's very cool in the shadows. So there's this really nice distribution of blue here. And then of course we have all these really nice warm spots of this neutral orange, which is of course the opposite of blue in the color wheel. So we have this really nice contrast of color, and nice contrast of scale and proportion, shape. Really, we can discuss even the difference in texture between the two. We have texture of the clouds. We have the texture of these areas with or without trees, these burned up spots, and of course this, rundown equipment. So that is where we're going to finish. Your very first assignment is now applying the terms that we have reviewed. I want you to take a photograph with your cell phone, focusing on each of the terms here that are listed. I want there to be a unique image for each of the terms. I know that a lot of images can apply to multiple terms, but I want you to focus specifically on one term as you are taking your photographs. I would also like to know which term you're applying to your pictures, and you can do that whatever you choose to make it the simplest, whether you want to change the file format or write it in perhaps whatever app you use in your phone to put text on a picture. That's fine, as long as I'm able to understand which term is related to each picture that you have, so that way I can understand if, maybe I can say, hey, it looks like Natalie over here doesn't understand what a focal point is. I'll make sure to review that next time. This will be due over the weekend. And if you have any questions, just reach out.